Might as well get started. Welcome here on this beautiful fall morning. Doesn't get any better than this in South Bend, right? Even Joe Biden thinks so, right? Rumors, what, mid-afternoon arrival? So is he come to visit you, John? Oh, okay. Well, hopefully it doesn't disrupt travel plans. But anyway, good morning. Welcome to the J.P. Dolan Seminar in American Religion. My name's Darren Dochuk, and I teach in the history department here, as well as serve with David Lantigua as co-director, William W. and Anna Jean Cushwa, co-directors of Notre Dame's Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism. And it's wonderful, as usual, to see so many familiar faces, as well as some new faces. And I want to extend a warm welcome, especially to those of you who are joining our Dolan Seminar for the first time. Twice each year, the Dolan Seminar in American Religion provides historians of North American religion and other interested scholars an opportunity to discuss a recent notable book published in the field. The topic of our seminar today is Emily Conroy-Krutz's book, Missionary Diplomacy, Religion and 19th Century Foreign Relations, which is very recent, published this year by Cornell University Press. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists for this morning, beginning with our author. Emily Conroy-Krutz is Associate Professor in the Department of History at Michigan State University, just up the road. She earned her PhD at Harvard and is a historian of 19th century America, specializing in the global history of the early American Republic. She has a particular interest in American empire and the international dimensions of American religion and reform. Emily is the author of numerous essays and articles, along with now 2 books. Her first book, Christian Imperialism, Converting the World in the Early American Republic, was published by Cornell University Press in 2015. You have a close relationship with Cornell, right? You're a series editor there as well. She was the 2019 recipient of the American Society for Church History's Jane Dempsey Douglas Prize and a 2020-2021 Fellow of the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard University. Emily has become a frequent and enthusiastic participant at our Dolan seminars. Thank you for joining us again today. Where's the knitting needles? All right, feel free. Amy, you too, feel free. So, we are fortunate to have 2 excellent commentators to get our discussion started this morning, Heather Curtis and Amy Greenberg. Heather Curtis is the Warren S. Woodbridge Professor of Religion at Tufts University, where she also serves as the director of the Center for the Humanities. She holds appointments in the Department of Studies in Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora, the Department of History, the Civic Studies Program, and the International Relations Program. She's busy. Heather also received her PhD from Harvard. Her research explores how religion has shaped responses to racial injustice, humanitarian disasters, economic crises, and illness from the late 19th century to the present. Her first book, Faith in the Great Physician, Suffering and Divine Healing in American Culture, 1860 to 1900, was published by Johns Hopkins University Press. Her most recent book, Holy Humanitarians, American Evangelicals and Global Aid, was published by Harvard University in 2018. Heather is currently working on a religious biography of Ida B. Wells for the Oxford University Press Spiritual Lives series. Her work has been supported by a number of fellowships and grants, including the Charlotte Newcomb Foundation, the Institute for the Study of American Evangelicals, and the Lilly Endowment. Heather, great to have you back at Notre Dame. Amy Greenberg is the George Winfrey Professor of American History at Penn State University, where she also serves as head of the Department of History. And yes, she got her PhD at Harvard too, which makes 4 out of 4, counting our lecture yesterday, making me feel all the more conspicuous for not wearing crimson. Harvard was my backup school, though. So. Amy is a historian of antebellum America with a particular interest in the relationship between the United States and the rest of the world in the decades before the Civil War. She is the author of 5 books, including A Wicked War, Polk, Clay, Lincoln, and the 1846 U.S. invasion of Mexico, Manifest Manhood and the Antebellum American Empire, Cause for Alarm, the Volunteer Fire Department in the 19th Century City. Her latest project is a study of 19th century attitudes towards imperialism, focused on ordinary Americans. She is a recipient of the George W. Atherton Award for Excellence in Teaching and the Public Scholar Award from the National Endowment for the Humanities. From 2020 to 2021, she served as president of the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. Thank you, Amy, for coming to Notre Dame and early to meet with students and faculty. It's been a pleasure to host you. I could say much more about the panelists. Go read their books, their other books. That'll be my charge. But we need to leave as much time as possible for their remarks in our conversation. So for those of you who are new to the seminar, we'll spend the first portion of the seminar hearing from our respondents and then from the author, each roughly 15 minutes. We'll pause for a break, have some more coffee, and then return for a Q&A session. So with that, please join me in welcoming our first commentator, Heather.
Good morning. So I'd like to begin by thanking Darren Dochuk for the invitation to participate in the, sorry, I've got a little frog in my throat, the Dolan Seminar in Religion here at the Cushwa Center. And I'm also deeply grateful for everyone who helped plan my visit and the larger conference, especially Madonna Nowak, so thank you so much. It's such a treat to have been invited to read Emily Conroy-Krutz's Missionary Diplomacy, Religion, and 19th Century American Foreign Relations carefully in preparation for this gathering, because Emily and I have been involved together in several collaborations, including the Religion in U.S. Empire project, which was spearheaded by Sylvester Johnson and Tisa Wenger, which resulted in an edited volume published in 2022. And as Darren mentioned, the seminar on Religion and Public Life in North America held at the Warren Center in 2020-2021, kind of at the Warren Center, mostly on Zoom. So through both of those initiatives, I had the chance to engage with this book as it was being written. So how exciting to be able to finally read it cover to cover and reflect on its many contributions to scholarship. So I'm going to begin by offering an overview of the main arguments in the book, and then raise a couple of questions that I hope we could help open up a broader conversation. So, in the spring of 1902, historian Henry William Rankin published a biographical sketch of his late uncle, Divvy Bethune-McCarty, in the New York Evangelist. As a missionary and medical doctor, McCarty had founded the first Protestant church in China and cared for 150 to 200 patients daily at the dispensary he established in Ningbo. He had also served as an interpreter for the United States Navy during the Taiping Rebellion, a translator for the American vice consul in Japan, and as a member of the United States consular staff in Shanghai, China. During his more than 5 decades of service in East Asia, Rankin declared, McCarty had played a crucial role in forging, quote, the international nexus between the Orient and the Western world. But despite McCarty's impressive array of governmental appointments, many contemporary readers disagreed with Rankin's assessment of his uncle's accomplishments as a U.S. diplomat. At the turn of the century, Rankin's claim that missionaries ought to be recognized as essential actors in international affairs went largely ignored. More than 100 years later, in her masterful study, Missionary Diplomacy, Religion, and 19th Century American Foreign Relations, Emily leaves no doubt that Rankin was right. Taking the McCarty family's multi-generational engagement with American Protestant missions as a point of departure, Emily expertly traces, quote, the intertwining global histories of church and diplomacy from the early republic through World War I. Organized into 3 major sections, each containing thematic chapters that proceed chronologically, missionary diplomacy shows how figures like McCarty shaped U.S. foreign policy in multiple ways over the course of the long 19th century. Wherever they traveled during these decades, from the American West to East Asia, the Middle East, the Pacific Islands, Central America, and Africa, Emily demonstrates, Protestant missionaries became, quote, key figures in the development of U.S. relations. From their first forays into foreign fields, she argues, Protestant missionaries positioned themselves as experts who could provide American policymakers as well as the general citizenry with essential information about people and places in other parts of the world. The first section of the book, Missionary Intelligence, 1810s to 1840s, highlights the strategies missionaries employed to establish their authority as, quote, informants to the American public and advisors to the U.S. government, end quote. And this was on a broad range of topics, including, quote, geography and climate, commerce and trade, politics and history, and the role of women in distant lands. Through their published writings in a variety of genres, from newspapers and magazines to memoirs, travel narratives, and historical treatises, missionaries shaped perceptions of foreign cultures. In some cases, they also succeeded in influencing government policies through personal interactions with leading officials, including members of Congress, secretaries of state, and even presidents, such as John Quincy Adams, William Henry Harrison, and John Tyler. Always, Emily rightly acknowledges, missionary intelligence involved the assertion of American power. Missionary claims of expertise, she writes, quote, helped to enforce an American and European worldview that justified and accepted as natural the dominance of the West over the East. As the 19th century progressed, Protestant missionaries played an even more direct role in U.S. foreign relations. So the second half of the book, or section of the book, Missionary Troubles, covers the decades from the 1840s through the 1880s, a period of, quote, profound transition in global politics and the world economy. During these years, Emily shows, missionaries like Divvy McCarty and many others took on formal diplomatic roles as consuls, translators, interpreters, and advisors. Although these missionary diplomats generally worked in partnership with the State Department to advance U.S. interest abroad, they also pushed for greater governmental intervention in issues and geographic areas that many politicians would have preferred to ignore. By insisting that the American government had a responsibility to protect the rights of its citizens to freely practice and preach their faith while residing overseas, for example, missionaries escalated tensions between the United States and numerous other nations, especially in the Middle East, but also in Central America, Africa, Asia, Russia, the South Pacific, and even parts of Western Europe. For this reason, State Department officials increasingly began to describe missionaries as troublemakers who complicated rather than only complemented U.S. foreign affairs. Debates about whether missionaries aided or impeded American diplomacy continued for the next several decades. As the State Department developed a more robust and professionalized diplomatic infrastructure in the years between the 1890s and 1920s, arguments about the propriety of missionary involvement in international relations intensified. The third section of the book, Diplomatic Missions, examines this ongoing dispute through studies of 4 crises in American foreign policy: the U.S. occupation of the Philippines, the Boxer Uprising in China, the exposure of Belgian atrocities in the Congo Free State, and the Armenian genocide in Turkey. Each of these cases, Emily contends, reveals the challenges missionaries faced as the United States became increasingly prominent in global politics. By the close of World War I, she concludes, a growing corps of career Foreign Service officers replaced missionaries as the experts in international affairs. But even so, missionaries had left their mark on the diplomatic landscape over the previous century. In their official capacities as agents of the U.S. government, As well as through their medical, educational, and humanitarian work abroad, Emily maintains, missionaries played crucial roles in expanding American influence across the globe. In addition to spreading the gospel, they promoted free market capitalism, exported democratic ideals, imposed Western gender norms, and propagated racial prejudices and civilizational hierarchies that justified U.S. imperialism. They also shaped the development of international law by demanding that the principle of extraterritoriality provide protection not only for U.S. citizens in foreign lands, but for their employees and Christian converts as well. More broadly, missionary appeals to religious freedom as a fundamental human right helped advance the image of the United States as a beacon and defender of liberty around the world, a view that has had profound consequences on American foreign policy to the present day. So missionary diplomacy is clearly a must-read for students of diplomatic history. The book builds on and extends a growing body of literature that elucidates the deep and complex entanglement of religion and international relations in the United States from the nation's founding to the present. Alongside historians such as Andrew Preston, whose pioneering work, Sword of the Spirit, Shield of Faith, Religion in American War and Diplomacy appeared in 2012, Lauren Turek, whose To Bring the Good News to All Nations, Evangelical Influence on Human Rights and U.S. Foreign Relations, which appeared in 2020, and of course, her own Darren Dochuk's 2019 book, Anointed with Oil, How Christianity and Crude Made Modern America. Emily argues persuasively that religious actors have played a central, if ambivalent, part in the expansion of American empire. She also intervenes in some of the most salient conversations in the fields of American religious history and religious studies more broadly, joining scholars such as Tracy Fessenden, Tisa Wenger, and many others in analyzing ongoing contestations over the definitions of the category of religion and the secular in and beyond the United States. Although Emily cites some of these colleagues in her endnotes, a more robust engagement with scholarly discussions in the disciplines of diplomatic and religious history would have helped me, I think, appreciate more fully missionary diplomacy's important contributions in both arenas. And so since we have representatives of both these fields and I think some others in the room, I think this is where I want to transition to raising some questions for a broader conversation. So Emily, let me begin by asking you how you see your book contributing to some of the scholarly discussions I've mentioned, or to other debates in the fields that I know you are engaged in, such as U.S. intellectual history or the history of the early republic. Missionary Diplomacy is such an expansive book and deals with topics and geographies that for me are very unfamiliar. So in some ways, I am raising the question because I would have really benefited myself from a little bit more historiography, not in the body of the text, which is so elegantly written and pitched just right for general readers and undergraduate audiences, so beautifully written, but in the notes where nerds like me turn to learn more about subjects beyond my area of expertise or to see how you're intervening in these critical scholarly debates. So just somewhat as an aside, I wondered whether you were under pressure from the publisher to reduce your word count and or avoid just long, extensive discursive footnotes so they could better market the book as a trade publication. And so if that's true, which it looks like it is, I think it would be interesting to have a broader discussion about how we can advocate for writing crossover books or trade books that aim to reach a wider public without having to give up the important work of laying out the stakes of our project as they relate to our academic disciplines and can tell the story of how your book is part of a broader conversation. So that's one thing that might be interesting to discuss. So one of the topics I would have appreciated like a long discursive footnote about is the criteria you use to determine which stories to tell in this sweeping survey of missions and diplomacy in this very long 19th century. So as I've already mentioned, the book is so impressively global in scope. You take us from the American West, where Congregationalist missionaries traveled with the Cherokee and other Native Americans expelled from their homelands along the Trail of Tears, to the Congo Free State, where Presbyterian William Shepherd protested the crimes of humanity he witnessed there, to many, many, many other places in the world. And yet, despite this incredibly expansive geography, there are some regions that get less attention than others, and some stories that you don't mention at all. For example, you discuss missionary activity in Hawaii at several points in the narrative, but you don't offer a detailed analysis of how the missionaries facilitated or resisted the overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom, surely a critical event in the history of U.S. foreign relations and imperialism. Similarly, while I appreciated greatly the inclusion of William Shepherd's interventions in the Congo, I wondered why he was the only African-American missionary to appear in the book. I was curious whether you considered discussing the colonization of Liberia, for example, and if so, why did you decide to leave that story out after all? So I know it would have been impossible for you to include all instances of missionary diplomacy over this long period, but how did you decide what to focus on and what to leave aside? Another footnote I would have loved to read would explain why white Congregationalist and Presbyterian missionaries were the main characters in your story. So the answer to this question is probably fairly obvious. These are the missionaries who interacted most with the State Department and who left the best records, for sure, the ABCFM boxes and boxes and boxes, and the Presbyterians too. But not all of your readers, especially those who aren't historians of American religion, will know this information. And I worry a little bit that they may end up assuming that all missionaries were white Congregationalists and Presbyterians. So to be fair, you definitely bring in Baptist and even Episcopalians as often as possible, and you're careful to show that missionaries were a diverse group who did not always agree on issues of theology or diplomacy. Even so, will some readers come away with the impression that missionaries were fairly homogenous and that there was such a thing as the American missionary movement? So I found my own self wondering about faith missionaries, Pentecostals, and other groups who embraced what you mentioned, the three-self theory of missions, that Native churches should be self-supporting, self-propagating, and self-governing, which was actually, as you know and right, an ABCFM idea to begin with. And some of these groups criticized American imperialism and rejected the connection between evangelicalism and civilization that most of your main characters applauded. So again, this might have been way too much to take on, but I wonder if you could say more about how your selection criteria, as well as the challenges you faced as you strove to do justice to missionary diversity in terms of theology, denomination, race, and change over time. So the sign of a truly magisterial work is that it prompts many questions, and I have so many more I'd like to ask, but in the interest of opening a wider discussion, I'm going to leave it there for now. Thank you, Emily, for this lucid, engaging, expertly argued book that was such a pleasure to read and promises to shape scholarship on missions and foreign relations for the foreseeable future.
In her 1841 treatise on domestic economy, Catherine Beecher, the nation's most influential proponent of the cult of domesticity, also known as the doctrine of separate spheres, visualized the influence of Christianity and Christian womanhood in particular as commensurate with the globe. Quote, "The woman who is rearing a family of children, the woman who labors in the schoolroom, the woman who in her retired chamber earns with her needle the mite which contributes to the intellectual and moral elevation of her country, even the humble domestic. Each and all may be animated by the consciousness that they are agents in accomplishing the greatest work that was ever committed to human responsibility. It's the building of a glorious temple whose base shall be coextensive with the bounds of the earth, whose summit shall pierce the skies, whose splendor shall beam on all lands, and who will hew the lowliest stone as much as those who carve the highest capital will be equally honored when its top stone shall be laid, with new rejoicings of the morning stars and the shoutings of the sons of God. Now, Catherine Beecher was not herself a missionary, but one of her siblings was. That may be a surprise to you. We feel like we know a lot about the Beechers. We certainly know about her famous father, Lyman, one of the most important ministers of his time. Of course, many of us know about her brother, Henry, who was himself a very famous minister and also became famous for having an affair with one of his married parishioners. And her sister, Harriet Beecher Stowe, needs no introduction. The sibling of Catherine's, who was the missionary, was her youngest brother, James. Now, James attended Amherst, and then he traveled to Canton as an officer of the East India Trade before returning there as a missionary in the early 1850s with his wife, Anne. Anne became addicted to opium and had to return home, where she entered a sanitarium. But James stayed on doing God's work until the onset of the Civil War, at which point he returned, joined the army, left the army to take care of Anne, who was declining. She died in 1863. Then James took over command of one of the first African-American regiments, the 1st North Carolina Volunteers. Now, James and Anne's ministerial experiences occurred after Catherine wrote her treatise on domestic economy, so I tell you their story not to suggest that her global vision of American influence stemmed from their missionary work. I think instead it's worth considering the complexity of James and Anne's story. This is not a story in which trade and religion are separate or opposed. James first visits Canton on a clipper ship buying and selling. And Anne, at least, is as much changed by her encounter with China as anyone in China is changed by what she has to offer. I would love to know how James's experiences in China shaped his experience leading the 1st North Carolina Volunteers. In short, the missionary encounter in China was not one-sided. It was transnational and complicated, and God wasn't always the one driving the encounter. I thought about the Beechers, Catherine, James, and Anne, as I read Emily Conroy-Krutz's wonderful new book. This is a book about Christian influence and American influence, and about a time, Catherine Beecher's time, when the two were not one but pretty close, when the missionaries were the experts and the State Department depended on missionaries to understand and approach the world, when missionaries were making an argument for expanding a particular American Christian influence around the globe and using the consular service to push further and do more than would otherwise be possible. Gradually, the two forces diverge, the State Department grows, the missionaries get in trouble and expect the consuls to bail them out. The U.S. occupation of the Philippines represents a turning point, both for U.S. empire and for the place of missionaries as U.S. agents abroad. The very question of whether a mission to the Philippines is a foreign or home mission reveals the tension inherent in attempting to work as missionaries in a place where the U.S. is the imperial power. Now, this could have been the close of Emily's story. And were it the close, we would have a very different book, a story of marginalization. That would be a less surprising story than what Emily provides us with. By carrying her narrative through World War I, she both complicates her narrative and increases the power of this volume to us as readers. The diplomatic missions of the early 20th century reveal the strengths and weaknesses of missionary power abroad. Missionaries are nothing but trouble in turn-of-the-century China, but their expertise is never more valuable or valued by the State Department than in the case of the Congo Free State and the Armenian genocide. Emily argues convincingly that the U.S. humanitarian response to these conflicts was driven by missionary diplomacy. This is a great contribution to our understanding of U.S. foreign policy in this period. Now, the strengths of this volume are many. First of all, how many of you noticed how beautifully the story is constructed? How her larger argument is advanced through topically focused chronological chapters, each of which focuses on an important character. Did you admire, as I did, how cleanly she summarizes complicated world events, like the breakdown of the Ottoman Empire, without simplifying them? Probably you didn't notice any of this because you were carried along with her story, and this is itself evidence of how well she's pulled off the challenge of writing a global history spanning an entire century. Of course, the biggest contribution of this volume is the argument Emily makes for the importance of centering missionaries in the story of 19th century U.S. foreign policy. Those of you familiar with her earlier work know that her first book, Christian Imperialism, transformed the way scholars of early American foreign relations think and talk about soft power. Although the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, the ABCFM, has long been recognized by religious studies scholars as a key early U.S. international, transnational organization. Before the publication of Christian Imperialism, the board and its activities received surprisingly little attention by historians of American foreign relations. Because the ABCFM was explicitly religious in its goals, activities, and to a large extent, its effects, it has escaped the critical eye of scholars outside the field of religion. Emily's first book showed the power of the ABCFM both at home and abroad in the early 19th century. Missionary diplomacy widens the scope of her analysis both chronologically and geographically. One of the big contributions here, and it might not be obvious to readers who are not scholars of US foreign relations, is her portrait of the evolution of the State Department. The focus in this volume is on missionaries, but there's important new research here on the growth of the consular system that could have become a standalone article and was very exciting for me to read. I really enjoyed her exploration of the challenges that these underpaid consuls faced as the only representatives of a State Department that was so weak it depended on missionaries for translation work, for information, and for local connections. This is a great accomplishment, and one of the best accomplishments of this book is the transnational effects that we see here. Transnational history is not easy to write, but we can see clearly in this book how both the US and other countries are shaped by the work of missionaries. I look forward to assigning this book in class. I think it's fabulous. Like Heather, I do have a few questions. First, Emily describes a dynamic in which missionaries become increasingly demanding that the State Department help them out of difficult situations. She describes this dynamic as stemming from the increasing numbers of missionaries abroad, as well as by the increasing power of the State Department. On one hand, this makes sense. You aren't going to appeal to a consul for help if you know that they can't help you, and the early consular system is so weak it can't do much of anything. But I'm wondering if there could be another dynamic at work, and that this tendency of missionaries to ask for help reflects a changing relationship of American individuals to their government. As an early Americanist, my mind goes first to the rise of Jacksonian democracy in the 1830s and the expectation that congressional representatives will represent the economic interests of the people in their district, not the larger good. My second question also focuses on the issue of cause versus correlation. Emily argues here that the push for US intervention on humanitarian grounds was first and most forcefully made by missionaries, and certainly her chapters on the Armenian genocide and the horrific conditions in the Congo Free State reveal the power of missionaries to shape US responses on humanitarian grounds. The New York Tribune correctly identified the missionary lobby as the, quote, silent unofficial cabinet, end of quote, advising President Wilson on whether to go to war against Turkey. But when I read her description of President McKinley praying for an answer to the question of what to do with the Philippines, and God telling him to take on the white man's burden, I found myself wondering, does this have to do with the precedent set by missionaries, or is it just his Methodism talking? There's a difference between McKinley's conviction being in accord with the commitments of missionaries and it being produced by them. And that led me to ask the larger question of what other forces were driving humanitarian intervention by the US government. Were the missionaries the only force, the most important? The conclusion of the volume left me wondering about where other US missionaries fit into this picture. Not only those who, as Heather mentioned, went to Liberia, but those of other denominations, and particularly those of the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints. Almost 13,000 LDS missionaries went abroad before 1900 and 50,000 between 1900 and 1950. Does this story look different if we think about those missionaries as Christian missionaries and consider their influence? Now let me end at Robert College, the first American college to be founded outside the United States, and founded, as Emily describes in this book, by missionaries. Robert College became Boğaziçi University, a Turkish public university in 1971, but it still occupies the same beautiful location on the Bosphorus, many of the original 19th century buildings, and even now feels like a US college, but to my mind, more Berkeley than Amherst. Depending on who you talk to, it's the most prestigious and most selective college in Turkey. And the language of instruction is still English. However, as I learned last year when I was lucky enough to visit, there are at present no classes on the history of the United States being taught at Boğaziçi. not because the government prevents it, although they are certainly struggling there to reconcile their mission and curriculum with the demands of the Erdogan regime, but because, as the head of the history department, Arzu Ataturkmen, told me, students are not interested in the United States. They look to Germany, they're interested in Russia, they care about the Middle East, and they want to know about China. I can't help but think that Catherine Beecher and the missionaries who populate Emily's book would care about this just as much as they would care about the freedom to worship in what was once called Constantinople. Thank you. And let me thank Darren, too, and Madonna, who's been so helpful in this visit.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much. So I want to start by thanking Darren and David and Madonna for inviting me here. Thank you all for showing up and reading this book. And of course, thank you to Heather and Amy. It is such a gift and really a rare treat to get to sit with scholars you admire so much who have taken the time to read so closely and raise excellent questions, and bring in Catherine Beecher, which I am always happy to be thinking about Catherine Beecher. So I'm thrilled that the book had you thinking about her. So Heather and Amy have done such a lovely job of outlining the book and some of its major contributions. So I thought I'd take a few minutes to talk about the motivations, a bit about the process, and start to answer some of the questions that they asked to perhaps spark ideas for our larger conversation after we take a coffee break. So as Amy talked about, my first book dealt with missionary conceptions of empire in the first decades of the 19th century. And I found myself coming into conversation with historians of American foreign relations at that point, and they were asking me new questions that were not the questions I'd been asked in religious history circles or in early republic circles, which is basically, as one foreign relations scholar put it quite bluntly, right? So these are very nice ideas you're talking about, but what is the policy implication of any of this? Why does this actually matter for American foreign relations? And I was really struck in that conversation because that was a question that I had really been desperately hoping not to be asked when I was writing my first book, when I was working on my dissertation. But by 2015, 2016, I thought, well, actually, I might have an answer to that, and I might be really interested in digging into the archives a bit more to think about how it is that this really robust mission movement actually engages with the State Department, actually shapes American foreign relations in ways that I think within American religious history, we sort of had a sense of, but as Amy said, right, foreign relations scholars were not taking seriously in the same way. And so I knew from the research of my first book that missionaries were traveling all over the globe in the first decades of the century. I knew that their supporters had very strong opinions about what the US should be doing in the world. But I wanted to dig deeper in this book to show how, when, and where those opinions shaped how the government acted. I was interested in tracing the ways that American diplomacy and American Protestant missions grew up alongside of each other over the course of the 19th century. And so the book was intended to talk about the development of the foreign mission movement alongside and in conversation with the development of the US State Department over the long 19th century. And so you've read the book, you've heard from our wonderful respondents already. As I sort of follow these missionaries around the globe, I wanted to draw out some of the themes that came up over and over again in multiple places. I'm particularly fascinated by the ways that missionary efforts were working to establish themselves as experts on the world who could and should advise the US government on how it should respond to world issues, the ways that missionaries served the US government in the consular system and as translators and advisors, sometimes at very key moments, such as the creation of treaties. How missionaries raised questions about the nature of citizenship and what protections the US government should provide for its citizens abroad, and how their activities forced the government to act in places and in ways that they would not have done otherwise, including intervening in humanitarian crises. And so this research brought me into missionary and state archives, and through lots and lots of published missionary writings in a wide range of genres. I really tried to get a broad sweep of what Protestant missionaries were up to, though of course there are limitations to that archive, and I will talk about how I made my selections of what came in and what did not. This was also a pandemic book, so maybe we can talk about that during the Q&A. I will say also what a gift it was to be on virtual fellowship at Harvard during the 2021-2022 years with Heather, with Will, hi Will, and sort of in conversation through that very difficult time, trying to figure out how to research and how to write a book like this with the limitations on archival practices that we all had during that time, and figuring out what this book wanted to be. So to the question, the really good question Heather asked of how I selected the stories that came in and the stories that did not make it. I love this question, and I struggled with this so much as I was writing. There is a fair amount that exists in sort of files of deleted materials on my computer. I have a file on my computer also of rabbit holes I will go down one day that I tried to kind of keep myself from. There could have been a lot more in here, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the work that other historians do to sort of develop some of those stories in time. So as I was thinking about what to keep in and what to skip, a couple of considerations that I had in mind. One was regional coverage. I wanted to make sure that I got a pretty broad sweep. So in the part 2, you may have noticed that each chapter contained at least 3 countries. As I was deciding which ones they would be, I had many color-coded charts that sort of changed at various times as stories sort of migrated from chapter to chapter. But I wanted to make sure that each of those themes I was representing sort of places that, so it wasn't as if troublemakers only were in China or victims were only in the Ottoman Empire, but wanting to make sure that I saw sort of that kind of sweep. So some stories fell out just sort of because of narrative need. But most importantly, it comes down to this, the connection to the State Department. So this is why I've got William Shepard and not other African-American missionaries in there. What was really striking as I was doing the research, and this also I think accounts for some of the denominational focus, as I was going to the State Department side of the archives and looking for, when do missions come up, who's showing up, who's in correspondence with the State Department, it really is those sort of white mainline Protestant missionaries who show up again and again, and some of the other denominations, African-American missionaries, I should say also male missionaries show up in the State Department archives and not women in the same way. And that was really interesting, right? So if this book had been just about 19th century missions and not about the missionary relationship to the state, there would have been a whole lot more women and there would have been a whole lot more African Americans in the story. The subset of missionaries who would get the ear of the State Department tend to be white and they tend to be male. And so what excited me about Shepard's story and wanting to put it in there was that it let me talk about that dynamic more explicitly than I would have been able to do otherwise. So earlier drafts of this book did not have the Congo chapter, and I was really excited about being able to put that in to deal a bit more with that question of who's getting, whose stories matter to the State Department and which missionaries' claims about what the US state should be doing are attended to. And that, of course, brings me to the fantastic question that Heather raises about the challenges of dealing with the diversity in the American foreign mission movement. Because I do talk about it as a singular movement when, of course, it is a very diverse one. Part of this was certainly a narrative challenge as I was working on the book. So hopefully we'll be able to talk about this a bit more as the morning goes on. I remember talking with my editor when I was first outlining the book, and he asked the same question that Amy did of, so how are you gonna put the Mormons into the story? And I said, Michael, how long do you want this book to be? Because I think one of the things that was a challenge for the book was telling both the religious changes in the United States, the political changes within the State Department, or so the organizational changes in the State Department, and sort of shifting global politics while making it readable and comprehensible. And so one of the things in various drafts, sort of some of that religious history is more foregrounded, and some of it's sort of brought a little bit more in between the lines. It took a long time figuring out the balance there. I think that there might have been, there's a version of this book that would have spent more time sort of talking about those denominational differences. Readers in this room might also notice that Catholics are not very present in here, aside from the Philippines chapter. And that was really it came down to narrative clarity, and I have all kinds of mixed feelings about that. But I think that hopefully that can be an invitation to other historians to keep writing and keep researching and do more work, because there is certainly a lot out there to be digging into. Let's see, what other questions do I'll take on the footnote question, I guess, as well. So yes, the minimal endnotes are largely an answer to the attempt to make this a so-called crossover book that could be read by a general audience, and the assumption that they don't want to read footnotes and they don't want to read that historiography. So you can find my more historiographical writing in journals and things like this, and we can certainly talk about it more here. One of the things that I really wanted to do as I wrote this book was to create a narrative for something I think a lot of religious historians took for granted, that missionaries mattered to the history of US engagement in the world. We just knew this to be true. And so this is where I think I'm sort of contributing to some of those conversations in religious history. I had sort of assumed that there was a book like this out there already, that someone had already written this book. But when I went looking for it, I found that while plenty of folks had told parts of the story, no one had put it all together yet. So one of the things I hope this book does is confirm something we had all suspected, and do it in a way that folks in other fields have to take seriously, about the way that religion in general and Protestant missionaries in particular shaped American policymaking from the very early decades of the 19th century. One of the things that's really struck me as I've talked with readers about the book so far, this is particularly when I'm talking to sort of churchy or religious audiences, has been the way that, so they talk about appreciating what one reader called the good, the bad, and the ugly when I talk about missionaries, that I don't write about missionaries as either sort of evil agents of empire or as benevolent forces of good in the world, but rather as people. People who had good intentions, major blind spots, priorities and preferences and ambitions all their own. I think within the field, of course, we've come a long way from talking about these kinds of historical figures as all one way or all another. But it's really striking to me that readers have been responding to the book in this way. And I think what they're noticing, and I think that what they're appreciating, is what we might call the historical context I provide for understanding missionary experiences and missionary engagement. And if that contextualization feels noteworthy, I think it's a reflection, maybe not so much of the historiography, but of the larger cultural conversation about religious history right now, and about religion and politics right now, that feels so very divisive. And I think it actually points a way for where historians of religion are really needed to take on a more vocal part of a public conversation. I really appreciate these readers and their desire for sort of a narrative of this complicated story, because there is, of course, a lot of critique of the 19th century missionary project in this book. It's imperialism, it's racism, it's cultural arrogance, it's often willful misunderstanding of international law. But those dynamics, of course, all exist alongside genuine efforts to improve people's lives, whether through education or medical care or evangelism. And so sometimes there were good effects and sometimes there were bad effects. There were always unintended effects. And whatever those effects were, they impacted not just missionaries, not just their supporters at home, not just the people they were trying to convert, but the relationship between the US and the rest of the world. And so what I hope the book does to help readers who are trying to make sense of all of these complicated legacies of this story today is to understand sort of how we got here, to know that it isn't an easy explanation with clear heroes and villains, but like all of history, it's a messy story with people and the very human bureaucracies that they create at its center. So from where I sit, the only way we're going to be able to move forward in a world that is still defined by the entanglement of these dynamics is if we can work through the ways that the past has shaped our present. I also want to say a little bit about sort of within diplomatic history and sort of readers who come to the book with a focus on foreign relations. I think there are two contributions that the book is making and two conversations I was really engaging with. One is chronological. Diplomatic history remains a field dominated by 20th century studies, particularly post-World War II studies. And Amy is sort of a pioneer in this, bringing the 19th century into the center, and I follow in her footsteps very happily. And so I hope that this book is a connection to some of that, why the 19th century matters, if what you're interested in is the 20th century. I hope that diplomatic historians in general can be, and particularly those who think about the role of religion, can sort of think more about who gets to be seen as an expert, why certain regions are treated differently than others in this 19th century history. Now the book, as Amy said, is one of many works that have been incorporating non-government organizations and people into our narratives of diplomatic history. It's part of what we've called the religious turn in diplomatic history. So Andrew Preston, of course, being one of the leaders of this. I've been recently working on a methodological article on how to do religion for diplomatic history. And so I've been thinking a lot about this religious turn and whether it's real, whether it actually happened. Usually folks talk about this turn sort of as a post-9/11 moment when scholars working on US foreign relations suddenly realized that religion might matter for how other countries understood the US, for how the US saw other countries. And so Preston's book, sort of The Spirit Shield of Faith, is one of the major texts that sort of announced the arrival of this subfield. And the idea that those of us doing this work is that religion is a central component of the ways that US operates in the world. Our claim is that you can't understand the history of the US and the world without understanding the role that religion plays in that history. And so my sense of the field as a whole right now is that if you were to go up to your friendly neighborhood diplomatic historian, they would say, yes, of course religion matters. But if you were to ask them why or how it matters, they might not have an answer for you, and they might be a little pissed off at you for asking. This is, I think, one of the things that this book is trying to do, is sort of step into this triumphalist religious turn and say, okay, we need to sort of fill in the answers there. At some point during the writing, I was having a wonderful conversation with a friend who's one of the editors of Diplomatic History, which is the major journal of Schaeffer, and she said something like, oh yeah, it's really interesting that missionaries pop up all over the place. They're in all of these archives, they're in all of these stories, and yes, exactly. So what I hope missionary diplomacy does is to help explain why missionaries keep popping up and why it really matters that they did. So I'll close there so that we can have more time for our big conversation. Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to talking with you all as the morning goes on.